Hey everybody, so let's talk about just a couple minutes and talk about our very first essay. Going to be based on our very first book, which is the very first Thanksgiving, with what the real story tells us about a loving God and learning from history, by Robert Tracy McKenzie. So if you haven't already got this book, I recommend getting it because we're going to dive into it and we're going to have an essay due in a few weeks. So information will be listed below on our page in our class, so check that out. But let's talk about it for a few minutes and what the main things you're going to get out of this book. First and foremost is, for me as a historian and as a Christian, sometimes it seems like those are two different paths. That you're taking academic classes and they're taking you off this direction one way, and your own personal faith and walk with Christ is another path. And it almost seems like a crossroad in two different directions. What this book does, and what I've learned over time as a historian, is that those paths are actually one and the same. And for you to grow in Christ, to grow in whatever field you're doing in this class, you're historians, you're taking on the hat of a historian, but also as a Simpson University student, you are growing personally in faith. That's the whole point of a wonderful Christian university, is to do that together. And for one to bolster the other, but one and the same. So we're going to look at this book in three specific ways. First off, we're going to look at the actual historical event. We've looked at narratives in history, and we've looked at the problems with a single narrative and how that can kind of miscue things and be able to take things off on a tangent. So McKenzie does a great job to explore the narrative that we know of the first Thanksgiving from 1621. Then secondly, we're going to look at then a little broader, taking the lens out and looking at the subject of history in its whole. What could we learn from this event and what we've been seeing this whole class of understanding history and how we use history? Why are we learning history? Why are you reading this book? What does history tell us as a society? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's going to talk a lot about values, how we see our own values, of what we see as important as an American and American values, and looking back and being subjective in history and choosing what we think is important in the past to create a narrative to show certain values of our culture. So it talks a lot about the event itself, first Thanksgiving. It talks about how we deal with history as a subject. And thirdly, most importantly, ourselves. How do we then look at this event as a Christian and as a Christian author to be able to see this as a personal walk with Christ? What can we learn from this event as Christians ourselves? And how does that show our own personal values, our own personal walk, our own personal journeys, and combine that with that journey and walk with Christ? So your essay is going to be on those three things, looking first and foremost at the first Thanksgiving as a historical narrative and understanding the history process in creating that narrative. And we're going to challenge it and see what we think about it, maybe looking at it a little different way. Secondly, we're going to look at what history tells us in general. How can we use history both as an active historian, looking at the past, not just being stuck in the archives and looking at old crusty books and records, but coming to the present and seeing how history really does affect our lives today. And then third, looking at ourselves through the mirror of history, being able to see ourselves in the pages of history and understanding our own values, who we are, and how our own personal growth is connected by seeing God working in the past, with individuals of the past, and how that is an example and really an empowering thing as a personal level for our own personal walk with Christ as a historian. So look below, we're going to have some information about this paper. I'm really excited about it because I'm going to leave the prompt pretty broad based on those three things, and for you to be able to take with it what you feel you're really connecting to. And I think that's going to be a good thing as we finish out this whole class for the rest of the semester, of how the narratives that we're looking at, the very nature of history, and your own personal reflection within history and your own personal walk with Christ. That is what I hope you get out of this whole class in general. So we get to talk about that, and I get to learn from you. And I think that's really important. Your own perspectives, your own worldviews is really going to be able to shine through as you write this paper. So if you have any questions about it, please, I encourage you to use our coffee house online, bounce ideas off together, maybe create some reading groups together where you can go by each chapter and discuss it with each other. And if you have questions, of course, if none of that works and you're just feeling lost, let me know, email me. We can always have a Zoom, Skype meeting, a Zoom meeting to be able to discuss it further. But I really hope you collaborate together. Get into small groups, or even talk about it in your small groups a little bit more of what this book is telling you personally and how you're going to write this paper. And I think if you talk about it and discuss it together, it's going to make it a lot clearer, it's going to make it a lot easier, and it's going to make those pages fly by when you write them and turn them in. All right, so we'll have it done just in time for your own personal Thanksgiving, and hopefully when you meet with family and friends, you'll be able to use this book as a great talking piece and be able to talk about what you've learned in a history class about the first Thanksgiving and using history in your own personal walk with Christ.